Welcome to Scary Stories to Fall Asleep. Hello and welcome, dear listeners. You found your way to Scary Stories to Fall Asleep, where we believe the perfect bedtime story balances on the edge of mystery without tipping into terror. If you enjoy tonight's tale, please consider subscribing to our channel for more atmospheric stories designed to ease you into dreamland with just enough intrigue to keep your imagination satisfied. Tonight's story will take you through the curious occurrences in an old attic apartment where the boundaries of reality aren't quite as fixed as they should be. So dim your lights, settle into your comfortable position, and let the gentle patter of rain in your imagination accompany you as we begin our journey into the shifting attic. Chapter 1: A Fortuitous Find. Oliver Bennett stood on the rain-slicked cobblestone street, water dripping from his oversaturated jacket as he double-checked the address scrawled on the soggy slip of paper in his hand. The Victorian townhouse loomed above him, its dark brick facade and ornate cornices reminiscent of a more elegant era in Boston's history. 5 stories of architectural splendor stretched skyward, crowned by a steep slate roof punctuated with dormer windows that peered down at the street like watchful eyes. The rental listing had appeared almost miraculously in his university's housing group, historic attic apartment, Beacon Hill, $600 per month, utilities included. In Boston's ruthless housing market, such an offer seemed impossible, especially in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. But desperation had overridden Oliver's natural skepticism. 3 weeks before the fall semester, his planned housing arrangement had collapsed and his roommate unexpectedly moved cross-country for a job opportunity, leaving Oliver scrambling for affordable accommodations. At 24, with his savings depleted and his teaching assistant position eliminated due to department budget cuts, the architectural history graduate student couldn't afford to be picky. His thesis on liminal spaces in 19th-century New England architecture was stalled. His student loans were mounting, and the fresh wound of his breakup with Elise still stung whenever her name appeared in his social media feeds. Oliver approached the weathered front door, its black paint chipped around intricate brass fittings that had oxidized to a muted green. A panel of buzzers lined the entryway, each labeled with handwritten cards in various states of fading. His finger hovered over the button marked simply, M. Lee, Management. A sharp crack of thunder made him flinch, and he pressed the buzzer more firmly than intended. The responding buzz of the door unlock came almost instantly, as if someone had been waiting for his arrival. The heavy door swung inward with a low, resonant creak that seemed to echo the building's age. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and old wood, illuminated by a modest chandelier that cast a warm glow over the worn but well-maintained parquet flooring. A narrow staircase curved upward along the wall, its banister polished to a high shine by generations of hands. "Mr. Bennett, I presume?" The voice came from a slight man who seemed to materialize from the shadows beneath the staircase. "Marcus Lee." We spoke on the phone. Marcus was younger than Oliver had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with sleek black hair and wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the light in a way that made his eyes difficult to see clearly. His fitted charcoal suit seemed at odds with the role of a building manager, giving him the appearance of someone playing a part rather than living it. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for meeting on such short notice." Oliver extended his hand, noting how cool and dry Marcus's palm felt against his own rain-dampened skin. "Not at all. The apartment has been vacant for some time. I'm eager to find the right tenant." Marcus gestured toward the stairs. "It's on the top floor." "I hope you don't mind stairs, the building is historical, no elevator." "I don't mind. My field is architectural history, actually. This building must be, 1870s? Marcus's lips curved into a thin smile. 1868, you have a good eye. The original owner was Theodore Blackwood, a merchant who made his fortune in international trade. Later in life, he developed some unusual interests in architectural theory. The top floor was his personal study before the building was converted to apartments in the 1920s. As they ascended the stairs, Oliver noticed the subtle changes in the building's character. The first few floors maintained the dignified Victorian aesthetics, but as they climbed higher, the hallways narrowed, the ceiling heights varied unexpectedly, and the angles of the walls seemed slightly off, not enough to be immediately alarming, but sufficient to create a vague sense of spatial disorientation. By the fourth-floor landing, Oliver was slightly winded, his messenger bag heavy with his laptop and books weighing on his shoulder. The stairwell grew narrower still as they approached the final flight, which curved more tightly upward. The overhead lighting became sparser, creating pools of shadow between dim, amber-tinted bulbs. "Almost there," Marcus said, his voice betraying no sign of exertion. "The attic apartment is something of a special case. It's not right for everyone. Is there something wrong with it?" Oliver asked, his financial anxiety immediately spiking. "Not wrong, no. Just particular. The architecture up here follows Blackwood's rather unconventional ideas. Some find it charming, others find it disorienting." Marcus paused at a door at the top of the stairs, a heavy wooden construction with an old-fashioned brass key plate. The previous tenant left rather suddenly. "Exchange program or something similar. Foreign student, I believe." He produced an ornate key from his pocket, its brass surface etched with an intricate geometric pattern that reminded Oliver of mathematical diagrams he'd seen in old alchemy texts. The key turned with a deep, satisfying click, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. "Here we are." "The Blackwood attic," Marcus announced with an almost ceremonial formality. Oliver stepped past him into the space and felt his breath catch. Despite the modest price, the apartment was stunning. The main living area stretched the length of the building, with dormer windows on both the street side and the rear, allowing natural light to flood the space even on this gloomy day. The sloped ceilings were higher than he'd expected, lined with exposed beams of dark, polished wood. The floors were wide planked pine that glowed with the patina only centuries of use could create. The layout was open yet intimate, a main living area with a small kitchen tucked into one corner, a bathroom behind a door to the left, and what appeared to be a snug bedroom alcove separated from the main space by an archway. Built-in bookshelves lined several walls, and window seats had been constructed beneath each dormer, creating perfect reading nooks. But there was something else about the space, something Oliver couldn't quite articulate. The proportions seemed to shift subtly as he moved through it, as if the room were quietly rearranging itself just beyond his peripheral vision. The angles where walls met ceiling appeared to vary despite the symmetrical exterior of the building. When he looked directly at any particular corner or feature, it appeared perfectly normal, yet the overall effect was of a space that didn't entirely conform to Euclidean geometry. "It's incredible," Oliver said finally, his academic interest piqued by the architectural anomalies even as the more practical part of his brain screamed that this apartment at this price in this neighborhood couldn't possibly be legitimate. "But I have to ask, why is it so affordable? There must be something I'm missing." Marcus adjusted his glasses, the lenses catching the light. "The attic has its quirks. The heating is uneven in winter. There are some noises, old pipes, settling foundations, wind through the eaves. And its unusual layout doesn't appeal to everyone. The last 3 potential tenants found it unsettling." "Unsettling how?" "They described a sense of spatial inconsistency. One woman said she felt like the dimensions changed when she wasn't looking. Marcus gave a dismissive wave. Suggestible people, I imagine. But I prefer to be transparent about these reports. The building is old, full of the settling and shifting that comes with age. Oliver moved toward one of the dormer windows, running his hand along the smooth wooden sill. Outside, rain continued to fall on Beacon Hill, blurring the lights of the city. From this vantage point, he could see across rooftops to where the golden dome of the Massachusetts State House gleamed dully in the gray afternoon light. I study these kinds of spaces, Oliver said, more to himself than to Marcus. The unusual architectural features actually make it more interesting to me. Then perhaps you're exactly the tenant this space has been waiting for, Marcus replied, his tone carrying an unusual weight. He extended his hand, offering the ornate key. Shall we say a 1-year lease to start? First month's rent due upon signing, which we can handle now if you're decided. Oliver hesitated only briefly. His bank account was dangerously low, his thesis deadline looming, and the prospect of affordable housing in such a historic building, walking distance from the university library, seemed too good to pass up, regardless of any architectural oddities. I'll take it, he said, accepting the key. Its weight felt substantial in his palm, the brass warm as if it had absorbed heat from Marcus's hand. Excellent. There's just one peculiarity about the lease I should mention. Marcus produced a folder containing a standard rental agreement. Due to certain historic preservation covenants, there's a clause requiring tenants to remain in residence during the full moon each month. The building's historical status is partially maintained through an unusual observance tied to the original owner's specifications. You simply need to be physically present in the apartment overnight. Oliver raised an eyebrow. That's unusual. Indeed. Blackwood had some eccentric stipulations in his will. Most are no longer enforceable, but this one remains tied to the property tax abatement that allows us to keep rents below market rate. It's essentially a formality, a quirk of old Boston property law. Marcus pointed to the clause in question, buried in the fine print of the lease. The requirement seemed odd but harmless enough. Oliver was unlikely to have overnight travel plans anyway, given his financial situation and academic obligations. He skimmed the rest of the lease, finding everything else fairly standard, and signed where indicated. Welcome to Blackwood House, Marcus said, accepting the signed documents and handing Oliver his copy. I live off-site but am available by phone. Mrs. Winters in apartment 3B has been here the longest, since the 1970s. She knows the building's rhythms better than anyone if you have practical questions. After completing the payment and receiving a brief orientation to the building's systems, Oliver found himself alone in his new home. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the dormer windows and slate roof tiles. The sound was oddly soothing, creating a cocoon of ambient noise that enhanced rather than disturbed the apartment's tranquility. Oliver set his bag down and began a more thorough exploration of the space. The kitchen, though small, included newer appliances than he'd expected. The bathroom featured original hexagonal floor tiles and a clawfoot tub with a retrofitted shower attachment. The sleeping alcove was just large enough for a double bed and a small bedside table, with a wardrobe built into the wall. As he moved through the space, that strange sense of shifting proportions persisted. When focusing on any specific area, everything appeared normal, but the overall experience of moving through the apartment created a subtle vertigo, as if the space occupied more or less area than should be possible given the building's exterior dimensions. In the main living area, Oliver noticed a small door, about 4 feet high, set into the wall beneath one of the sloped ceiling sections. It blended so seamlessly with the wainscoting that he might have missed it entirely if not for the tiny brass knob that caught the light. He knelt and tried the knob, but the door was locked. Storage space, presumably, though the placement seemed odd. He made a mental note to ask Marcus about it later. As evening settled in, Oliver retrieved his few possessions from temporary storage. He didn't own much. Books comprised the bulk of his belongings, along with a modest wardrobe, a laptop, and basic kitchenware. By midnight, he had arranged his essential items and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted from moving but quietly exhilarated by his good fortune in finding such a unique living space. That night, he dreamed of corridors that extended beyond possible dimensions, of doorways that led to rooms that couldn't physically exist, and of a young woman with dark hair who walked through walls as if they were mist. In the dream, she turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the light of a full moon, and whispered, "It changes when it wants to. Not when you want it to." Oliver awoke with the first gray light of dawn filtering through the dormer windows, the dream fading but leaving behind a lingering unease. He sat up and gazed around the sleeping alcove, reassuring himself that everything was exactly as it had been when he fell asleep. And yet, something felt different about the space, something he couldn't quite identify. The dimensions seemed adjusted somehow, as if the walls had shifted by inches during the night. He shook his head, attributing the sensation to the disorientation of sleeping in a new place, and began his first full day in the Blackwood attic. He couldn't have known that the waxing moon was already building toward its full phase, or that with each passing night, the true nature of his unusual new home would gradually reveal itself, along with the fate of the previous tenant who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Chapter 2, Settling In. The first week in the attic passed uneventfully as Oliver established his routine. Morning light streamed through the east-facing dormers, waking him naturally as it painted geometric patterns across the wooden floor. His days took on a pleasant rhythm, breakfast at the small kitchen table overlooking the neighborhood, then either working on his thesis at one of the window seats or walking to the university library for research. The apartment proved even more perfect for his needs than he'd initially thought. The built-in bookshelves now housed his collection of architectural texts and monographs, arranged by period and region. The window seats became his favorite spots to read, each offering a different perspective on the city, one toward the historic streets of Beacon Hill, another toward the Charles River and Cambridge beyond. It was on the third evening when Oliver first noticed something unusual. Returning from a long day at the library, he set his keys on the small table by the door, a habit from childhood that his mother had instilled in him. As he moved toward the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner, he paused, a sense of wrongness tickling at the edge of his awareness. The table wasn't where it had been that morning. Oliver stood motionless, staring at the small wooden side table. He was certain it had been positioned directly beside the door, yet now it stood nearly 2 feet to the left. The shift was subtle enough that he might have dismissed it as faulty memory, except that he distinctly remembered bumping his hip against it on his way out that morning. "Huh," he muttered, approaching the table and examining it as if it might offer some explanation. The floor beneath showed no signs of having been dragged, no scratch marks on the old pine boards, no disturbed dust. It was as if the table had always been in this position. Oliver shook his head and continued to the kitchen, attributing the discrepancy to the stress of adjusting to a new space. He prepared a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table, opening his laptop to review his day's research notes. As he ate, his gaze kept drifting back to the side table by the door, its wrongness nagging at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. That night, he dreamed again of the dark-haired woman. This time, she stood by his bed, looking down at him with an expression of mingled curiosity and warning. You should mark the walls, she said, her voice distant as if traveling across a great space to reach him. Mark them so you'll know when they move. Oliver woke with a start, his heart racing. The dream had been so vivid that he half expected to see the woman standing in his bedroom. Instead, moonlight cast long shadows across the empty room, creating illusions of movement in the corners of his vision. He glanced at his phone, 3:17 a.m. Too early to start the day, too unsettled to immediately fall back asleep. Oliver slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the kitchen for a glass of water. As he passed through the main living area, that sense of spatial wrongness returned, stronger this time. Oliver stopped, looking around carefully. Something was different, but in the half-light of the moon, he couldn't immediately identify what had changed. He flicked on a lamp and surveyed the room. The bookshelf that had been against the north wall now stood along the east wall instead. His books remained perfectly arranged, undisturbed, as if the entire unit had been lifted and repositioned with surgical precision. The reading chair that had faced the window now angled toward the center of the room. The vintage rug that covered the center of the floor had rotated approximately 45 degrees. What the hell? Oliver whispered, moving to the bookshelf and running his hand along its edge. Everything was solid, real. This wasn't a dream or hallucination. He remembered his dream, mark them so you'll know when they move. Operating on impulse, Oliver retrieved a roll of blue painter's tape from a box of supplies he hadn't yet unpacked. Working methodically in the dim light, he placed small strips of tape on the floor at the corners of each piece of furniture. He added additional markers at the edges of the rugs and along the baseboards at regular intervals. It was nearly 4:30 a.m. by the time he finished. Exhausted but strangely calmer for having taken action, Oliver returned to bed and fell into a dreamless sleep until his alarm woke him at 8 o'clock. Morning sunlight revealed his blue tape markers in all their obsessive glory. In daylight, his nocturnal activity seemed like an overreaction. Nevertheless, he left the tape in place, curious to see if it would help him track any more movements in the apartment's layout. As he prepared for the day, a knock at his door startled him. He wasn't expecting visitors, and Marcus hadn't mentioned any building maintenance being scheduled. When he opened the door, he found a small, elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite her age, which Oliver guessed to be at least in her 80s, she stood straight-backed and alert, bright blue eyes examining him with undisguised interest. "Good morning," she said, her Boston accent pronounced but refined. "I'm Abigail Winters from 3B. I make it a point to properly welcome new tenants." She extended a hand, and when Oliver shook it, he was surprised by the strength of her grip. "Oliver Bennett. Nice to meet you. Mr. Lee mentioned you're studying architectural history. How fitting." Her gaze moved past him to the apartment beyond, lingering on the blue tape markers visible on the floor. One eyebrow raised slightly. "I see you've noticed the apartment's peculiarities already." Oliver hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal about his experience. "The space is interesting. The proportions seem unusual." Mrs. Winters nodded. Blackwood was fascinated by non-Euclidean geometry and what he called malleable space. Most dismissed him as eccentric, but he was quite serious about his theories. She gestured to the tape markers. "Those won't help, by the way. Not in the traditional sense. You know about the changes?" Oliver asked, surprised by her matter-of-fact tone. "I've lived here since 1972, young man. I've seen tenants come and go from this attic. Some stay years, others barely a month. She reached into her cardigan pocket and produced a small paper bag. Fresh scones. A welcome gift. Oliver accepted the bag, the warmth of the pastries seeping through the paper. Thank you. Would you like to come in for coffee? I'd love to hear more about the building. Mrs. Winters glanced at her wristwatch. Another time, perhaps. I have my painting class this morning. But a word of advice, she leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. The full moon is in 3 days. You might want to prepare yourself. Before Oliver could ask what she meant, Mrs. Winters had turned and begun making her way back down the stairs with surprising agility for her age. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the bag of scones in hand, wondering what exactly he needed to prepare for. Closing the door, Oliver returned to the kitchen and placed one of the scones on a plate. It was still warm, studded with cranberries and orange zest. As he ate, he considered Mrs. Winters' cryptic warning and the strange dreams he'd been having. On impulse, he opened his laptop and searched for information about Theodore Blackwood, the building's original owner. Most results were brief mentions in historical records of Boston commerce, noting his success in international trade. A few sources mentioned his eccentric interest in theoretical architecture later in life, but provided few specifics. A deeper search led Oliver to a digitized archive of the Boston Architectural Society, which included a scanned journal article from 1889 titled On Dimensional Fluidity in Residential Spaces, by T. Blackwood. The article was dense with Victorian prose and mathematical formulas that Oliver only partially understood, but certain passages stood out. I propose that domestic architecture need not be confined to the rigid constraints of three-dimensional space as commonly understood. A properly designed dwelling might exist in multiple spatial configurations simultaneously, with the barrier between these states being permeable under specific conditions. And later. My experiments suggest that lunar cycles, particularly the full moon, provide optimal conditions for the thinning of spatial boundaries. During such periods, the malleable qualities of carefully designed spaces become more readily apparent to the observant occupant. Oliver sat back, the half-eaten scone forgotten on his plate. Blackwood wasn't merely eccentric, he appeared to have been developing theories about spaces that could physically reconfigure themselves in response to lunar cycles. The rational part of Oliver's mind dismissed this as pseudoscientific Victorian spiritualism, no different from the period's fascination with seances and ectoplasm. But another part of him, the part that had witnessed his furniture rearranging itself overnight, wasn't so quick to judge. He glanced at his calendar. The full moon would indeed occur in 3 days. Whatever Mrs. Winters was warning him about would happen then, if her cryptic message was to be believed. Oliver spent the rest of the day at the university library, diving deeper into historical records about Blackwood and the building. He discovered that Blackwood had died in 1893, reportedly while conducting what newspaper accounts vaguely described as an architectural experiment in his attic study. The coroner's conclusion of natural causes was questioned by some contemporaries, who noted unusual circumstances surrounding the body's discovery. By evening, Oliver had compiled a small collection of notes and photocopied articles about Blackwood and his theories. He returned to the apartment as twilight was falling, the streets of Beacon Hill taking on a mysterious quality in the fading light. Gas lamps, maintained for historical authenticity in this part of the city, cast pools of warm light on the cobblestones, and shadows stretched long between the centuries-old buildings. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Oliver noticed how the stairwell seemed to wind more tightly than he remembered, creating an impression of ascending much higher than 5 stories. By the time he reached his floor, he felt slightly dizzy, as if the gravitational pull had shifted subtly during his climb. At his door, Oliver paused, key in hand. A soft scratching sound came from within the apartment, a faint but distinct noise like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, now seeming to come from the far side of the apartment. Oliver took a deep breath and inserted his key. The lock turned with that same satisfying click he'd noted on his first day, and he pushed the door open slowly. The apartment appeared normal at first glance. His blue tape markers remained in place at the corners of the furniture. Nothing seemed overtly disturbed. Yet as he moved through the space, that sense of wrongness returned. The room felt subtly larger than it had that morning, not dramatically so, but enough that the change registered on some intuitive level. The scratching sound had stopped completely. Oliver checked each corner of the apartment, looking for signs of mice or some other explanation, but found nothing. As he approached the small locked door beneath the sloped ceiling section, however, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a thin line of what appeared to be pencil marks along the doorframe, like hash marks counting days. They were faint, barely visible unless viewing from just the right angle. Oliver ran his finger along the marks. There were 28 of them, a lunar month. Below them, in tiny script, were initials, EC. Elena Carrera, Oliver whispered, the name coming to him unbidden, though he couldn't recall where he'd heard it. The previous tenant? Marcus had mentioned a foreign exchange student but hadn't provided a name. That night, Oliver's sleep was restless. The dreams returned, more vivid than before. The dark-haired woman, Elena, stood by the small door, her hand on the knob. "It doesn't open for everyone," she said. "Only those it chooses." "What's behind it?" Oliver asked in the dream. "Everything that was, and everything that might be." She turned the knob, and moonlight spilled from the opening door, bright enough to wake Oliver in the real world. He sat up, disoriented. Moonlight was indeed streaming through his window, but the small door remained closed, its brass knob gleaming dully in the silver light. Oliver switched on his bedside lamp and reached for his notebook, recording the dream while it was still fresh in his mind. As he wrote, he realized the scratching sound had returned, faint but unmistakable, like someone trying to communicate through the walls. 2 days until the full moon. Whatever was happening in this apartment, whatever had happened to Elena Carrera, Oliver sensed he was about to discover it for himself. Chapter 3, The First Change. The day before the full moon dawned bright and clear, Boston's notorious humidity temporarily abated by a cool northerly breeze. Oliver woke feeling more rested than he had in days, the disturbing dreams of the night before fading to vague impressions in the morning light. He checked his blue tape markers as had become his habit. Most remained perfectly aligned with the furniture they marked, but several along the baseboards had shifted position by several inches, not enough to be immediately obvious, but clear evidence that something was changing in the apartment's dimensions. Oliver took his coffee to the window seat overlooking the street and opened his laptop. He'd been avoiding working on his thesis since moving in, distracted by the apartment's mysteries, but deadlines were looming. The irony wasn't lost on him that his thesis topic, liminal spaces in 19th century New England architecture, had suddenly become far more personal than academic. As he began reviewing his notes, a notification popped up on his screen, an email response from the Boston Historical Society to his inquiry about Theodore Blackwood. Dear Mr. Bennett, thank you for your interest in Theodore Blackwood. While our archives contain limited personal papers from Mr. Blackwood, we do have a collection of architectural drawings and journals that may be relevant to your research. These materials are not digitized and must be viewed in person. Of particular note is Blackwood's final journal, 1890 to 1893, which contains extensive notes on what he termed dimensional architecture. This journal has been requested only twice in the past decade, most recently by a Boston University student named Elena Carrera approximately 6 months ago. If you would like to schedule an appointment to view these materials, please contact our archival department directly. Best regards, Margaret Chen, Boston Historical Society. Oliver stared at the screen, his coffee cooling beside him. Elena Carrera had been researching Blackwood just as he was now. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be chance. Had she discovered something in Blackwood's journal that explained the apartment's strange properties? And more importantly, what had happened to her afterward? The scratching sound returned suddenly, startling Oliver so badly he nearly knocked over his coffee mug. This time, it seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, traveling in a line from one corner of the room to another, as if something was moving through the space between the walls. "Hello?" Oliver called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. "Is someone there?" The scratching stopped abruptly. For several seconds, silence filled the apartment. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, a whisper seemed to emanate from the small locked door. "Soon." Oliver jumped to his feet, pulse racing. He approached the door cautiously, kneeling before it. "Elena?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No response came. He placed his hand on the small brass knob and tried turning it again, but it remained firmly locked. The surface of the door felt unusually warm beneath his palm, almost as if it were alive. Oliver spent the rest of the morning at the Boston Historical Society, poring over Blackwood's journals and architectural drawings. The journals confirmed what the article had suggested. Blackwood believed that properly designed spaces could exist in multiple configurations simultaneously, with transitions between states occurring naturally during full moons or being triggered deliberately through certain architectural mechanisms. Most intriguing were Blackwood's detailed drawings of the attic space, Oliver's current apartment. The original plans showed a much more complex layout than what currently existed, with hidden chambers, sliding panels, and curious geometric alignments that Blackwood claimed would facilitate dimensional fluidity. One journal entry from October 1892 caught Oliver's attention. The attic transitions have become more pronounced with each lunar cycle. "Last night, I observed the north wall shift a full 3 feet, revealing the secondary study as I had theorized. Most remarkable was that objects left in one configuration remained in their relative positions when the space reverted at dawn. I believe I am close to achieving permanent transition between states." A marginal note, added in a shakier hand, read, "Warning, do not remain in transition spaces during the change. Fluctuating dimensions may trap the unwary between states." The final journal contained increasingly erratic entries, culminating in a page dated January 17, 1893, 3 days before Blackwood's death. "Tomorrow brings the full moon and my final experiment. I have calculated that a complete reconfiguration of the attic space is possible if all mechanisms are engaged simultaneously at the exact moment of lunar apex. If successful, I shall have proof of my dimensional theory. If unsuccessful, well, science demands its sacrifices." The journal ended there. Whatever Blackwood had discovered, or whatever had happened to him, went unrecorded. As Oliver was preparing to leave, the archivist approached him with a slim folder. "I thought you might be interested in this," she said. "When I pulled the Blackwood materials, I found this research request form filed by Elena Carrera." She listed her contact information and research purpose. Oliver thanked her and examined the form. Elena had been a graduate student in theoretical physics at Boston University, researching non-Euclidean geometry in practical architecture. She had listed the same address as Oliver's apartment and provided a phone number and email address. On impulse, Oliver sent a text message to the number, "Hello. My name is Oliver Bennett. I'm currently renting the attic apartment at Blackwood House where you previously lived. I'm trying to understand some unusual aspects of the space and would appreciate any information you might have." He didn't really expect a response, but it seemed worth trying. As he left the Historical Society and walked back toward Beacon Hill, he found himself looking at the buildings around him with new eyes, wondering what other architectural secrets might be hidden behind their historic facades. Upon returning to the apartment, Oliver noticed something immediately: the blue tape markers had moved again. Not just a few inches this time, but dramatically. The walls themselves seemed to have shifted position, creating a slightly different floor plan than the one he'd left that morning. The changes were subtle enough that the apartment still felt familiar, but significant enough to create a sense of disorientation. The window seat where he'd had his coffee now faced in a slightly different direction. The kitchen appeared a few feet smaller. The sleeping alcove had deepened, creating more of a separate room than a nook. Oliver checked his phone, no bars of service, which was unusual for this part of the city. He tried his laptop and found the Wi-Fi connection similarly dead. As evening approached, Oliver felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with dread. The full moon would rise in less than 24 hours. According to Blackwood's journals, that would trigger the most significant transition in the apartment's configuration. He considered leaving, spending the night elsewhere and returning after the full moon had passed. But the lease clause requiring his presence during full moons now made troubling sense. And more importantly, something compelled him to stay, to witness whatever would happen. If Elena Carrera had disappeared because of the apartment's strange properties, perhaps his presence during a transition might provide clues to her fate. Oliver spent the evening preparing. He gathered emergency supplies, flashlight, batteries, water, snacks, and placed them in a backpack. He took photos of the apartment's current configuration and made detailed notes about the positions of furniture and the dimensions of each space. He tried the small door once more, still finding it firmly locked. As he was making these preparations, his phone chimed with a text message notification. Service had inexplicably returned, at least momentarily. The message was a response to his text to Elena's number. Not Elena. Found her phone in apartment 2A storage last month. Who are you? How did you get this number? Before Oliver could respond, another text arrived. Whatever you do, don't stay for the full moon. Elena didn't listen either. Oliver typed quickly, "Who is this? What happened to Elena?" The reply came seconds later, "Mrs. Winters. Come to 3B now. Not safe to discuss via text." Oliver grabbed his keys and headed downstairs to Mrs. Winters' apartment. As he descended, he noticed that the stairwell seemed to spiral differently than it had earlier, the distance between floors expanding and contracting unpredictably. By the time he reached the third floor, he felt slightly nauseated from the spatial distortion. Mrs. Winters opened her door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching for him. Her apartment was a stark contrast to the shifting strangeness of the attic, a warm, perfectly normal space filled with comfortable furniture, bookshelves, and walls covered with impressive landscape paintings that Oliver assumed were her own work. "Sit," she said, gesturing to an armchair. "We don't have much time. The pre-moon shifts have already started. You know about the apartment changing?" Oliver asked, taking the offered seat. Everyone in the building experiences some effects during the full moon, but the attic is the focal point. Blackwood designed the entire building as a machine of sorts, with the attic as its control center. Mrs. Winters handed him a cup of tea. I've lived here long enough to adapt to the minor fluctuations we experience on the lower floors. But the attic, that's different. What happened to Elena Carrera? Mrs. Winters' expression darkened. She was brilliant, a physicist studying theoretical dimensions. When she discovered the apartment's properties, she was fascinated rather than frightened. She began experimenting, trying to understand the mechanisms Blackwood had built into the space. And Oliver prompted when Mrs. Winters paused. She believed she could control the transitions, use them to access what she called parallel configurations of the same physical space. She was particularly interested in the small door. The locked one under the sloped ceiling, Oliver interrupted. Yes. Elena became convinced it was a direct portal between dimensional states, but that it would only open during the apex of a full moon transition. Mrs. Winters sipped her tea. The last time I saw her was the morning before a full moon, about 4 months ago. She was excited, said she was close to a breakthrough. After that night, she never emerged from the apartment. Did anyone check on her? Marcus Lee reported that she had abruptly left for her home country. Her belongings were gone, the apartment cleaned out. But, Mrs. Winters leaned forward, lowering her voice, I know she hadn't planned to leave. And her phone was found weeks later in a storage space, along with a journal she'd been keeping about the apartment. Do you have the journal? Oliver asked urgently. Mrs. Winters shook her head. Marcus took it. He's more involved with the building's peculiarities than he lets on. I believe he's a descendant of one of Blackwood's associates, though he's never confirmed this directly. What do you think happened to Elena? I think she's still in the apartment, in a manner of speaking. Mrs. Winters met his gaze steadily. Just not in the same configuration of it that you currently occupy. A chill ran down Oliver's spine despite the warmth of the room. You're suggesting she's trapped in some alternate version of the space? That's impossible. So is furniture that moves on its own and walls that shift position. Mrs. Winters set down her teacup with a decisive click. Listen carefully, Oliver. Tomorrow night, during the full moon, the attic will undergo its most dramatic transformation. If you stay, you need to be prepared. Don't try to open the small door, no matter what you hear from the other side. And most importantly, remain in the center of the main room during the transition. Those caught between shifting walls when they move may find themselves elsewhere. Like Elena, Oliver murmured. Possibly. I can't be certain that's what happened to her, but the timing suggests it. Mrs. Winters rose from her chair with a slight grimace, her age showing momentarily in her stiff movements. The safest option would be to leave the building entirely until the full moon has passed. The lease requires me to be present during full moons, Oliver reminded her. Yes, Marcus is quite insistent on that clause. I suspect he's continuing Blackwood's work in some capacity. She walked to a bookshelf and removed a small wooden box. If you're determined to stay, take this. The box contained a compass that looked antique but was in perfect condition, its needle quivering slightly before settling on north. Beside it lay a piece of chalk and a small silver key that appeared too ornate for any conventional lock. The compass was Blackwood's, Mrs. Winters explained. It doesn't point to magnetic north but to what he called dimensional constants, fixed points that remain stable during transitions. The chalk is for marking your position if you become disoriented. And the key? She hesitated. I'm not entirely sure what it opens. It was found in Blackwood's hand when he died, clutched so tightly they nearly couldn't pry it from his fingers. Oliver accepted the box, the items inside feeling unnaturally heavy for their size. Thank you. I'll be careful. See that you are. I've watched too many attic tenants disappear or flee over the decades. Mrs. Winters walked him to the door. If you change your mind about staying, my couch is available to you. As Oliver climbed back up to the attic, the stairwell seemed to have normalized somewhat, though the journey still felt longer than it should have. When he reached his door, he paused, listening. The scratching sound had returned, more insistent now, accompanied by what sounded like distant whispers in a language he didn't recognize. Inside, the apartment had shifted again. The changes were more pronounced, the ceiling height varied dramatically across the space, highest near the center and dropping to barely 6 feet near the walls. The windows remained in their original positions, but the walls between them had curved inward, creating alcoves where none had existed before. Most disturbing was the small door, which had somehow migrated from its original position to the center of the north wall, now directly opposite the entrance. It appeared larger than before, its brass knob gleaming as if recently polished. Oliver set down the wooden box from Mrs. Winters and approached the door cautiously. The whispers grew louder as he neared it, resolving into words he could almost understand. He placed his hand on the knob, not turning it but simply feeling its smooth, cool surface. "Elena," he called softly. "Are you there?" The whispers ceased abruptly. Then, clear as if the speaker stood beside him, "Don't open it yet. Not until the moon is full." Oliver jerked his hand away from the knob. The voice had been distinctly female, with a slight accent he couldn't place. Elena's voice? Or something else using her voice? He retreated to the center of the room, where he'd set up a small desk for his laptop. The Wi-Fi had returned mysteriously, and he found himself with multiple notifications, emails, social media alerts, text messages, as if the apartment had temporarily blocked all communications and then released them at once. Among them was an alert from his calendar app reminding him that tomorrow night's full moon would also be a rare, blue moon, the second full moon in a calendar month. Oliver recalled from Blackwood's journals that the architect had placed special significance on blue moons, believing they intensified the dimensional transitions. As Oliver prepared for bed, the apartment continued to subtly shift around him. The bathroom door now opened from the opposite side. The kitchen cabinets had rearranged themselves. His books had reordered on the shelves, now organized by color rather than subject. He placed Mrs. Winters' compass on his bedside table, watching as its needle swung slowly in a complete circle before settling on a point that definitely wasn't north. According to the compass, north now pointed directly at the small door that had migrated to the center of the wall. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, he walked through endless variations of the apartment, each configuration slightly different from the last. In some, the ceilings soared cathedral-like above him, in others, they pressed down claustrophobically. Doorways led to impossible spaces, vast libraries, winding staircases that descended far below the building's actual depth, windows that opened onto landscapes that couldn't exist in Boston. And in every variation, the dark-haired woman, Elena, watched him from a distance, trying to communicate something he couldn't quite grasp. Oliver woke at dawn to find the compass spinning rapidly on his nightstand, its needle whirling like the second hand of a watch running at impossible speed. The apartment had changed again overnight, the most dramatic shift yet. His bed now sat in the center of the main room rather than in the sleeping alcove. The windows had multiplied. Where there had been 4 dormer windows, there were now 7, arranged in an asymmetrical pattern that shouldn't have been possible given the building's exterior. Most alarmingly, the small door had grown again, now nearly the size of a standard door, its brass knob replaced with an elaborate handle carved to resemble intertwined serpents. It pulsed with a subtle rhythm, as if breathing. Today was the day of the full moon. Tonight, according to both Blackwood's journals and Mrs. Winter's warning, the apartment would undergo its most dramatic transformation. Oliver checked his phone, no service again. His laptop showed no Wi-Fi connection. He was cut off from the outside world, alone in a space that seemed increasingly alive around him. The scratching sounds had stopped completely, replaced by a low, almost subsonic hum that vibrated through the floorboards. As Oliver made coffee in the kitchen, which had somehow rotated 90 degrees from its previous position, he found himself wondering if he should take Mrs. Winters up on her offer to spend the night on her couch. But curiosity and a strange sense of responsibility kept him from leaving. If Elena Carrera was somehow trapped in another configuration of this apartment, might this be his only chance to find her? And beyond that, as a student of architectural history, how could he walk away from experiencing what might be the most extraordinary architectural phenomenon ever created? As the day progressed, the apartment's changes accelerated. Walls bulged and receded like breathing lungs. Doorways appeared and disappeared. The floor developed subtle slopes and variations in height. Through it all, the compass needle spun ceaselessly, occasionally stopping briefly to point at seemingly random locations before resuming its rotation. By late afternoon, Oliver had given up trying to work or maintain any semblance of normal routine. He sat cross-legged in the center of the main room, Blackwood's journal spread around him, the compass and chalk from Mrs. Winters at his side. He'd packed a small bag with essentials, water, energy bars, flashlight, first aid kit, prepared for whatever the night might bring. As sunset approached, a knock came at his door, the first external contact since his visit to Mrs. Winters the night before. When Oliver opened it, he found Marcus Lee standing in the hallway, impeccably dressed as always in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable behind reflective glasses. "Mr. Bennett," Marcus said with a slight nod. "I've come to ensure you're prepared for tonight's event." "You mean the full moon transition," Oliver replied, not bothering to hide his knowledge. "Or whatever you call it when the apartment completely rearranges itself." A thin smile crossed Marcus's face. "I see Mrs. Winters has been informative. May I come in?" Oliver stepped aside, allowing Marcus to enter. The landlord surveyed the transformed apartment with a professional eye, noting the expanded door, the multiplied windows, the strange geometries that had developed throughout the space. "A particularly active pre-moon phase," Marcus commented. "The blue moon influences are already evident." "What happened to Elena Carrera?" Oliver asked directly. Marcus turned to face him, removing his glasses for the first time. His eyes were unusual, the irises seeming to shift color like oil on water. "Miss Carrera made choices that led to unfortunate consequences." "That's not an answer." "It's all the answer I have. She experimented with forces she didn't fully understand, despite my warnings." Marcus replaced his glasses. "I've come to offer the same warning to you. Stay in the center of the room during the transition. Do not approach the door, no matter what you hear or see. The door that keeps getting bigger. The one that was small yesterday and is now almost human-sized. That door exists in all configurations of this space, though its appearance and position may change. It leads, elsewhere. Marcus glanced toward the door in question. Blackwood designed it as an emergency exit of sorts, a way to move between dimensional states when necessary. But using it requires specific knowledge that I suspect you don't possess. And Elena tried to use it? I believe so, yes. Marcus straightened his already perfect tie. The transition will begin at moonrise, approximately 8:17 p.m., and reach its apex at 11:42 p.m. when the moon is at its zenith. The most extreme phase will last approximately 20 minutes. During that time, I strongly advise remaining completely still in the center of the main room. What if I want to leave the apartment entirely? Oliver asked. That would violate your lease agreement, Marcus replied smoothly. Additionally, the stairwell undergoes its own transitions during full moons. Attempting to navigate it would be inadvisable. Oliver gestured to the compass and chalk. Mrs. Winters gave me these. She said the compass points to dimensional constants. Marcus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Winters should not have given you Blackwood's instruments. However, since she has, I advise using them as intended. The compass will indeed help you identify stable points during the transition. With that, Marcus moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. One final piece of advice, Mr. Bennett. If you hear voices during the transition, particularly familiar voices, do not trust them implicitly. The space between configurations can produce echoes that are not what they seem. Before Oliver could ask what he meant, Marcus had stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The lock engaged with an ominous click, though Oliver couldn't recall seeing Marcus use a key. Alone again, Oliver checked his watch, 6:45 p.m. Less than 2 hours until moonrise. He gathered his emergency supplies and Blackwood's journals, placing them in the center of the room along with a comfortable chair. Whatever happened tonight, he was determined to document it as thoroughly as possible. As the light outside faded, the apartment seemed to hold its breath. The subtle shifts and changes momentarily paused as if gathering energy for what was to come. Oliver sat in his chair, Blackwood's compass in one hand, a piece of chalk in the other, waiting for the moon to rise and the true nature of his strange apartment to reveal itself. Chapter 4, Moonrise. At precisely 8:17 p.m., Oliver felt it begin. The change didn't announce itself with dramatic movements or sounds, but with a subtle alteration in the quality of the air, a shift in pressure that made his ears pop, followed by a deepening of shadows in the corners of the room. The ambient light took on a bluish tinge that had nothing to do with the moon outside, which was just cresting the horizon and still hidden from view at his windows. Oliver checked Blackwood's compass. The needle, which had been spinning aimlessly for hours, suddenly stopped, pointing firmly at the center of the ceiling. Looking up, Oliver noticed that the ceiling, once a simple sloped plane interrupted by dormers, had developed a shallow dome at its center. The dome's apex glowed faintly, as if collecting light from an unseen source. The first physical change came 10 minutes after moonrise. With a sound like stretching leather, the east wall began to bow outward, expanding the floor space by several feet. Simultaneously, the floorboards rippled in a wave-like motion, rising and falling as if the apartment were breathing. Oliver's chair remained stable, but the sensation of movement beneath him triggered a momentary vertigo. He opened Blackwood's journal to a blank page he'd prepared and began taking notes, forcing himself to document the changes with scientific detachment despite the growing strangeness around him. 8:27 p.m. First major shift. East wall expanding outward. Floor displaying wave-like movements. Compass pointing to ceiling dome. Temperature dropping noticeably. The temperature change was subtle but unmistakable. Within minutes, the apartment had cooled by several degrees, his breath now visible as a fine mist. The cooling seemed to emanate from the small door, which had begun to contract after its earlier expansion, now shrinking back to approximately 3 feet in height. As the moon rose higher, visible now through one of the dormer windows, the changes accelerated. Walls folded inward at impossible angles, creating corners that seemed to contain more space than should be physically possible. The 7 windows that had manifested earlier in the day began to migrate slowly around the perimeter of the room, like the hour markers on a clock face moving gradually counterclockwise. The scratching sounds returned, no longer confined to the walls but emerging from various points throughout the space, under the floorboards, above the ceiling, within the furniture itself. They formed patterns that almost resembled language, a rhythmic scratching that Oliver suddenly recognized as Morse code. He fumbled for his journal, transcribing the sounds as best he could. / dash. I am here. 8:52 p.m., scratching sounds forming Morse code message, I am here. Windows rotating counterclockwise around room perimeter. Small door contracting. Temperature continues to drop. Compass now pointing to northeast corner where a new archway is forming. The archway had appeared silently, materializing in what had previously been a solid wall. Beyond it, Oliver could see what appeared to be a continuation of the apartment, but with subtle differences, different colored walls, furniture he didn't recognize, bookshelves filled with volumes bearing Cyrillic titles. The Morse code scratching changed its pattern. Dash. / dash. / dash. Dash. / dash. Straight face. Dot. Do not enter archway. As if responding to the warning, the archway began to narrow, the space beyond it stretching away perspective-defying distance, as if the few feet of actual building depth somehow contained a space that extended for hundreds of yards. 9:17 p.m. 1 hour into transition. Archway forming in northeast corner shows space beyond with different decor. Morse code warning, do not enter ARCHWAY. Compass needle erratic, jumping between multiple points. Main door to apartment, exit to hallway, has disappeared completely, replaced by a wall of bookcases. Oliver realized with a jolt that he was now effectively trapped in the apartment. The door through which he'd entered, through which Marcus had visited earlier, had vanished entirely. In its place stood floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with ancient-looking tomes whose titles he couldn't read from his position. The small door, which had been contracting, suddenly expanded again with a wooden groan, stretching upward until it reached the height of a standard door. Its surface changed from plain wood to elaborately carved panels depicting mathematical formulas and geometric shapes that seemed to move subtly when viewed from his peripheral vision. A whisper emanated from it, barely audible at first but growing gradually stronger. "Oliver, help me." The voice was unmistakably female, with a slight accent, Spanish, perhaps, or Portuguese. Could it be Elena Carrera? He remembered Marcus's warning about not trusting voices during the transition, but the plea sounded so genuine, so desperate. 9:38 p.m., small door expanded to full height. Voice emerging from behind it calling my name, asking for help. Female voice with accent. Exit door completely gone. Room temperature now approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit and still dropping. Compass spinning rapidly except when pointed at small door, when it becomes completely still. Oliver rose from his chair, drawn toward the voice despite his misgivings. The compass in his hand spun wildly until he pointed it at the small door, at which point the needle froze, pointing directly at the ornate handle. "Elena," he called. "Is that you?" "Yes. Please, I've been trapped so long. The door will open now, but only for a few minutes during the transition." Oliver hesitated, torn between his curiosity and Marcus's explicit warning. He took a step toward the door, then stopped, remembering Mrs. Winter's advice to remain in the center of the room. "How do I know it's really you?" he called. "How do I know this isn't some trick of the transition?" The voice paused, then came back softer. "You've been marking the furniture with blue tape. You found my initials by the small door. You have Blackwood's compass." These were all true statements, details that seemed to confirm the speaker's identity. But something about the voice had changed subtly, an undertone that hadn't been there before, a hollowness that raised the hairs on Oliver's neck. Before he could respond, the apartment underwent its most dramatic shift yet. The ceiling dome suddenly expanded upward, stretching into a tower-like structure that couldn't possibly fit within the building's actual dimensions. The walls rippled and flowed like liquid, furniture sinking into the floor and re-emerging in different locations. The windows, which had been rotating around the perimeter, suddenly multiplied again, creating a kaleidoscopic effect as moonlight streamed in from impossible angles. Oliver staggered as the floor beneath him tilted sharply. He grabbed his emergency backpack and retreated to what he hoped was the center of the room, though with the space in constant flux, it was difficult to be certain of any position. The chalk Mrs. Winters had given him tumbled from his pocket. Acting on instinct, he knelt and drew a circle around himself, a boundary between his small stable space and the fluid chaos beyond. The moment the chalk circle was complete, the motion sickness he'd been fighting subsided. Within the circle, the floor remained level and stable while outside it continued to shift and ripple. The chalk glowed faintly with a blue-white light, similar to the moonlight streaming through the windows but more concentrated. 10:12 p.m., major transition event. Room completely restructuring. Drew chalk circle as barrier, appears to create stable zone. Voice from door growing more insistent. Compass now alternating between pointing at door and spinning wildly. Temperature approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit. "Oliver, please," the voice from the door called, more urgently now. "The circle won't protect you when the apex comes. You need to choose a configuration and secure it. I can show you how if you open the door." Again, the information seemed plausible. Blackwood's journal had mentioned the need to secure a preferred configuration during transitions, though it hadn't specified how this was accomplished. "Tell me what happened to you first," Oliver called back. "How did you get trapped?" "I tried to map all possible configurations," the voice replied. "I discovered there are exactly 12 stable variations of this space, each accessible during a different month's full moon. But during a blue moon, a 13th configuration appears, a master configuration that connects all others. I became trapped between states when I tried to access it without the proper key." "What key?" Oliver asked, thinking of the silver key Mrs. Winters had given him. The voice paused again, longer this time. When it returned, it sounded different, multiple voices speaking in unison, Elena's accent now layered with other tones and timbres. "The silver key. You have it. Bring it to the door now." The command held such force that Oliver found himself taking a step forward before he caught himself. This wasn't right. The desperation in the voice had transformed into something demanding, almost threatening. A new sound entered the apartment, a deep, resonant tolling like a distant church bell. Oliver checked his watch, 10:30 p.m. The transition had been underway for over 2 hours, with the apex still more than an hour away. 10:30 p.m., bell-like tolling heard throughout space. Voice from door now sounds like multiple voices speaking together. Demanding the silver key. Temperature continuing to drop, now approximately 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Windows have multiplied to 12, arranged in perfect circle around room perimeter. The 12 windows now formed a perfect circle around the perimeter of the dramatically expanded room, each showing a slightly different view of Boston, some in daylight, others in night, some in winter snow, others in summer greenery. Oliver realized he was seeing the same location through different temporal states, perhaps the 12 configurations Elena had mentioned. The small door had changed again, its wooden surface now appearing metallic, with complex mechanical elements visible along its frame. The handle had transformed into an elaborate lock mechanism with multiple keyholes arranged in a circular pattern around a central aperture. The tolling bell grew louder, its vibrations shaking dust from the ceiling dome above. The chalk circle around Oliver began to flicker, its protective glow weakening with each toll. "The circle will fail at the 11th bell," the multi-layered voice announced. "Use the key before then, or you will join us." Us. Not me. Whatever was behind that door, Oliver was increasingly certain it wasn't simply Elena Carrera. The bell tolled a 5th time, then a 6th. With each resonant boom, the apartment shifted more dramatically. Walls folded into impossible geometries. The floor outside his chalk circle became transparent in places, revealing other rooms below, not the apartment on the 4th floor that should have been there, but spaces that couldn't exist within the building structure, vast libraries, laboratory-like chambers filled with strange equipment, living spaces decorated in styles spanning centuries. The 7th bell toll brought a new development, writing appearing on the walls, glowing letters in multiple languages forming and dissolving like smoke. Oliver recognized equations from Blackwood's journals among the shifting symbols, along with diagrams of the building showing layers of space stacked like pages in a book. 10:45 p.m., 7 bell tolls. Writing appearing on walls, equations, diagrams. Chalk circle weakening. Voice insisting key must be used before 11th bell. 12 windows showing different temporal versions of Boston. Compass needle now moving in regular rhythm, like a metronome. The 8th bell brought a rush of wind through the apartment, though none of the windows were open. Papers from Oliver's desk swirled through the air, some passing through solid objects as if the physical barriers had become permeable. The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the windows despite the apparent summer conditions visible through some of them. Oliver retrieved the silver key from his emergency pack. It felt unnaturally heavy and cold, its ornate design matching the central keyhole in the door's new lock mechanism. The 9th bell tolled, and the chalk circle flickered violently, patches of it fading entirely before re-illuminating. Final warning, the voice intoned, now so layered with multiple tones that it barely sounded human. Use the key or become part of the transition. Your choice, Oliver Bennett. The 10th bell brought near darkness, the moonlight from the windows dimming as if something were passing between the moon and the earth. In that darkness, Oliver saw something he hadn't noticed before, thin, luminous threads stretching from the small door to various points around the apartment, including several that terminated at his chalk circle. The threads pulsed with energy, like fiber optic cables transmitting data. One of the threads led to the compass in his hand, which had stopped its mechanical movement and now glowed with the same luminous quality as the threads. When Oliver held it up, he saw that instead of directions, the face now displayed a series of symbols matching those on the silver key and the door's lock mechanism. In that moment of clarity, Oliver understood. The compass wasn't just a navigation tool, it was a decoder, a key to understanding the correct sequence for using the silver key. And the voice behind the door had been growing increasingly desperate to obtain the key before Oliver figured this out. The 11th bell tolled, and as predicted, the chalk circle failed completely, its light extinguishing like a blown candle. The floor beneath Oliver tilted sharply, nearly causing him to lose his balance. The threads connected to where his circle had been pulled taut, trying to draw him toward the door. 11:17 p.m. 11th bell. Chalk circle failed. Luminous threads visible connecting door to various points in apartment. Compass displaying symbols matching key and lock. Room in near darkness. Apex approaching in 25 minutes. Too late, the voice boomed, no longer making any pretense of being human. You will join the configuration. The apartment seemed to collapse in on itself, walls and ceiling rushing toward the center where Oliver stood. He closed his eyes, certain he was about to be crushed, but instead of impact, he felt a sensation of falling, as if the floor had opened beneath him. When he opened his eyes, Oliver found himself in a vast, circular chamber that couldn't possibly fit within the building's dimensions. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them, each identical to the small door that had grown throughout the evening. Above, instead of a ceiling, he saw the night sky with a full moon directly overhead, impossibly large and blue-tinged. In the center of this impossible room stood a figure with their back to him. Dark hair fell to their shoulders over a Boston University sweatshirt. "Elena?" Oliver called, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. The figure turned slowly. It had Elena's face, or what Oliver assumed was Elena's face based on his dreams, but her eyes were wrong, pupilless and reflecting the blue moonlight like mirrors. When she spoke, her voice contained the same multi-layered quality he'd heard through the door. "Not just Elena," the figure said. "All of us. Everyone who opened the door without understanding the key." Around the perimeter of the room, other figures emerged from shadows, men and women of various ages, all with the same reflective eyes. With a shock, Oliver recognized Theodore Blackwood from photographs he'd seen, along with others dressed in clothing spanning different eras. The 13th configuration, Elena's figure continued, gesturing to the space around them. The nexus point connecting all possible versions of the apartment. Blackwood built better than he knew, a space that exists simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, with this chamber at its heart. "What happens now?" Oliver asked, clutching the compass and key tightly. "Are you trapped here?" "We are the configuration," came the reply from multiple voices at once. "And now you will join us, adding your dimensional energy to the whole. Unless..." The Elena figure extended a hand. "Unless you use the key correctly and reset the cycle." Oliver looked down at the compass. Its face had changed again, now displaying a clock-like pattern with the current position aligned with the symbol that also appeared on the silver key. He realized it was showing him not just which keyhole to use, but when to use it, a specific moment during the transition apex. "Reset the cycle. What does that mean?" Oliver asked, trying to buy time as he studied the compass. "Blackwood built this chamber to access knowledge from all possible versions of reality," the figure explained. "But he made a miscalculation. The chamber requires consciousness to maintain its stability, human minds that can comprehend the dimensional variations and hold them in relation to each other. Those who enter become part of its architecture, merged with all alternate versions of themselves across configurations. And if I reset the cycle, one of us goes free, returned to their original configuration, while a new consciousness takes their place. A trade, essentially. Use the key, and choose who is released. Oliver checked his watch, 11:38 p.m. 4 minutes until the apex. The compass needle began to move again, ticking slowly toward the central marking that he assumed represented the proper moment to use the key. If I release someone, I become trapped here. Oliver confirmed, though he already knew the answer. The figures around the room nodded in unison, their reflective eyes gleaming. You don't belong here anyway, the Elena figure said, her voice momentarily separating from the collective. This isn't your story, Oliver. You were just meant to help conclude mine. A memory flashed through Oliver's mind, his thesis topic on liminal spaces, his fascination with boundaries and thresholds in architecture. How convenient that someone with exactly his academic interests would end up in this apartment immediately after Elena's disappearance. How perfectly he fit into the gap she had left. Marcus arranged for me to take this apartment, Oliver realized aloud. He knew about my research, knew I'd be curious enough to stay during the full moon. This was planned. Marcus serves the cycle, the collective voice confirmed. As did the building manager before him, and the one before that. The configuration must be maintained. The compass needle continued its steady progress toward the apex marking. Oliver had less than 2 minutes to decide. Use the key and trade places with one of the trapped consciousnesses, or refuse and join them anyway, adding his mind to the collective while no one went free. If he were to use the key, who would he choose to release? Elena seemed the obvious choice. She'd been trapped most recently, had a life that was likely still waiting for her. But something about this felt wrong, engineered, as if you were following a script written by Blackwood generations ago. What if I use the key differently? Oliver asked suddenly. Not to release an individual, but to change how the configuration works. The figures around the room stirred uneasily, moonlight reflecting from their eyes in nervous flickers. The key operates as designed, the collective stated, but with less certainty than before. One enters, one leaves. The cycle continues. Oliver looked again at the compass, studying its symbols more carefully. The face displayed not just the clock-like progression of time, but smaller markings around the edge, variations on the central symbol, each rotated to a different angle. It reminded him of a combination lock with multiple correct positions depending on what was being unlocked. The Elena figure stepped toward him, hand still extended. Time is almost gone. Make your choice now. The watch read 11:41 p.m. Less than a minute remaining. The compass needle aligned almost perfectly with the central apex symbol. In that moment, Oliver made his decision. Instead of inserting the key into any of the visible keyholes, he placed it in the center of the compass itself, into a small aperture he hadn't noticed before. The fit was perfect. I choose to break the cycle, he said, and turned the key. The reaction was immediate and violent. The compass glowed blindingly bright, the needle spinning at impossible speed. The floor beneath them trembled, and the hundreds of doors around the perimeter began to swing open simultaneously, revealing glimpses of different versions of the apartment across time and space. What have you done? The collective voice howled, the figures around the room convulsing as if in pain. Used the key as Blackwood actually intended, Oliver replied, understanding blooming even as he spoke. The compass isn't just a guide, it's the true lock. The door was a distraction, a trap. Blackwood regretted creating this chamber, regretted the cost in human consciousness. The key was his fail-safe, a way to release everyone at once. The chamber began to collapse inward, the doors slamming shut one by one, the walls contracting. The collected figures, including Elena's, began to dissolve into particles of light that streamed toward the doors before they closed. As the space compressed around him, Oliver felt a hand grasp his arm. The Elena figure, already half-transparent, looked at him with eyes that were suddenly human again, the reflective quality gone. "Thank you," she said in a single, natural voice. "Find me in the waking world." Before Oliver could respond, a final shock wave of energy pulsed outward from the compass, and darkness claimed him. Chapter 5, Aftermath. Oliver awoke to sunlight warming his face and the distant sounds of Boston traffic filtering through an open window. For several disorienting moments, he couldn't remember where he was or how he had gotten there. His body ached as if he'd run a marathon, and his hand was clenched tightly around something cool and metallic. Slowly, the events of the night came back to him: the transforming apartment, the bell tolls, the impossible chamber with its hundreds of doors, turning the key in the compass. He opened his hand to find the silver key fused to the compass, the two objects now inseparable, the needle fixed permanently at the apex position. Oliver sat up gingerly and surveyed his surroundings. He was in the attic apartment, but it had changed again, or perhaps reverted. The space appeared normal, with right angles and proper dimensions. The furniture stood in logical positions, no longer subject to the shifting geometries of the previous night. The small door that had dominated his attention was back in its original location, once again an unremarkable storage access about 4 feet high. His watch read 9:17 a.m. He had been unconscious for nearly 10 hours, yet he felt as if he'd barely slept at all. Oliver rose unsteadily to his feet and made his way to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. In the mirror, he looked much the same, though perhaps with a few more strands of gray in his dark hair than had been there the day before. His eyes, thankfully, were normal, no reflective, pupilless gaze staring back at him. A knock at the door startled him. For a moment, he considered not answering, unsure if he was ready to face Marcus or Mrs. Winters after what had happened. But curiosity won out, and he moved to the door, still clutching the fused compass and key. When he opened it, he found neither his landlord or his elderly neighbor, but a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a Boston University sweatshirt, and her expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "Oliver Bennett?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "Yes," he replied, his own voice rough from disuse. "My name is Elena Carrera. I believe you broke a very old cycle last night, and I need to understand how." Oliver stared at her, momentarily speechless. She appeared solid and real, not the half-transparent figure he'd seen dissolving in the collapsing chamber. Her eyes were normal, warm brown with a researcher's intensity. "You're really here," he said finally. "It worked." "May I come in?" she asked, glancing past him into the apartment with obvious apprehension. Oliver stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Elena moved cautiously, as if expecting the space to shift around her at any moment. When nothing unusual happened, some of the tension left her shoulders. "It feels normal," she said with evident surprise. "For the first time since I lived here." "I think it is normal now," Oliver replied. "Or as normal as it's going to get. The configurations collapsed when I used the key." Elena's gaze fixed on the fused compass and key in his hand. "That's Blackwood's failsafe. Where did you get it?" "Mrs. Winters gave me the key and compass separately. I didn't realize they were meant to be combined until I was in the chamber." Elena nodded slowly. "Mrs. Winters was the only one who suspected the truth. She's been living in this building for decades, observing, trying to understand Blackwood's true intentions. Marcus and his predecessors deliberately misinterpreted Blackwood's work to maintain the cycle. "What happened to you?" Oliver asked. "The last thing I remember, you were dissolving along with the others as the chamber collapsed." Elena moved to the window seat, the same one where Oliver had sat that first morning, and looked out at the Boston skyline. "I was trapped for what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. In the chamber, time doesn't work the same way. I was aware of being part of a collective consciousness, merged with others who had been absorbed over the decades. At the same time, I maintained some sense of individual identity." She turned back to him. "When you turned the key in the compass, it severed the dimensional bonds that held us in the chamber. We were all released simultaneously, returned to our original time periods and configurations. For most, that meant returning to the moment they were trapped, which for some was over a century ago. But you're here now, in the present," Oliver pointed out. "Because this is my present. I was trapped only 4 months ago. I woke up this morning in my new apartment across town, with full memories of being absorbed into the configuration but also with a complete life that continued in my absence, a life where I chose to leave the attic apartment after experiencing some minor paranormal activity, rather than staying to investigate." She gestured around the room. "It's as if the universe reconstructed a plausible alternate history where all of us made different choices, choices that kept us safe from the chamber." "And Marcus?" Oliver asked. "What about him?" "As far as I can tell, he doesn't exist in this reconstructed timeline. The building is now managed by a property company. When I tried to look up records of Marcus Lee, I found nothing, as if he never existed at all." Oliver sat heavily in the nearest chair, trying to process this information. "So we're in some sort of revised reality? One where Blackwood's dimensional experiment never fully succeeded?" "I think we're in the reality Blackwood actually wanted," Elena replied. "Based on my research, he realized too late the human cost of his experiment. The chamber began absorbing consciousness before he understood its full nature. His last act was to create the fail-safe, the compass and key combination, but he was absorbed before he could use it himself." She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "The notes I found suggested that Blackwood intended his work to allow humans to perceive multiple possible realities simultaneously, to expand consciousness, not trap it. Something went wrong in the implementation." Oliver looked down at the fused compass and key. "And now it's over. The cycle is broken permanently." "I believe so, yes. The apartment may still have some unusual properties, it exists at a nexus point of weak dimensional boundaries, but it should no longer actively absorb consciousness or undergo dramatic reconfigurations." As if to test this theory, Elena approached the small door that had been the focus of so much activity the night before. She knelt and turned the knob. This time, it opened easily, revealing a dusty storage space containing nothing more remarkable than some old building maintenance supplies and a box of holiday decorations. "Just a closet," she said with a small smile of relief. "As it should be." Oliver joined her at the open door, peering into the mundane storage space. "I still don't understand why I was drawn into this. Why this apartment, why me specifically?" Elena closed the closet door and stood. "Your thesis topic. Your interest in liminal spaces and architectural boundaries. The configuration was weakening, it needed a specific type of consciousness to maintain itself, someone who could conceptualize dimensional theory from an architectural perspective. You were the perfect candidate. Marcus arranged for me to find the apartment listing," Oliver realized. "He engineered the whole thing." "He or whatever he actually was," Elena agreed. I'm not convinced Marcus was entirely human. He may have been a manifestation of the configuration itself, seeking self-preservation. They moved to the kitchen, where Oliver prepared coffee for them both. The simple, normal activity felt surreal after the events of the previous night. As they sat at the small table with their mugs, Oliver studied Elena's face, trying to reconcile the real woman before him with the entity he'd encountered in the chamber. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Continue my research, but with a new focus. What Blackwood discovered has implications for physics that go beyond architectural curiosity. If spaces can exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, it challenges our most fundamental understanding of reality." She sipped her coffee. "What about you? Will you stay in the apartment?" Oliver glanced around the now normal space. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to run as far away as possible. But another part is still curious," Elena finished for him. "I understand. That's how it got me too. The apartment is still significantly underpriced for this neighborhood," Oliver said with a wry smile. "And I do need to finish my thesis." Elena laughed, a warm, genuine sound that confirmed her humanity more than anything else. "Speaking of which, I think your thesis topic might need updating. Liminal spaces in 19th century New England architecture seems a bit tame compared to what you've experienced. Dimensional fluidity in Blackwood's architectural theory, a case study of non-Euclidean spaces in urban environments," Oliver suggested with a grin. "Perfect. We could co-author it." Elena's expression grew more serious. "That is, if you're willing to continue exploring this together, perhaps. I could use an architectural historian's perspective, and you might benefit from a theoretical physicist's approach." The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. Despite the terror of the previous night, Oliver found himself intrigued by the possibilities Elena was suggesting, a collaboration that could lead to genuine breakthroughs in understanding Blackwood's work. "I'd like that," he said. "Though maybe we conduct our research somewhere other than this apartment, at least at first." "Agreed. My new place has much more predictable dimensions." Her smile returned. "And no creepy landlords who may or may not be manifestations of interdimensional architecture." As they continued talking, making plans for their collaboration, Oliver felt the last of his unease about the apartment fading. Whatever it had been, whatever danger it had posed, that phase seemed to have passed. The attic was now just an attic, unusual in its design, perhaps, but no longer actively malevolent. Later that afternoon, they visited Mrs. Winters in apartment 3B. The elderly woman appeared unsurprised to see Elena, greeting her as if they had parted only recently rather than months ago. When Oliver showed her the fused compass and key, her eyes filled with tears. "Theodore would be pleased," she said softly. "He never intended to trap anyone. His vision was about expansion, not imprisonment." "You knew all along what the compass and key would do together," Oliver said. "It wasn't a question." Mrs. Winters nodded. "I suspected. My grandfather was Blackwood's assistant. He witnessed the experiment that supposedly killed Theodore, though he always maintained that Blackwood hadn't died in the conventional sense. Family stories passed down suggested the failsafe existed, but its exact nature was lost to time." She took the fused objects from Oliver, examining them with reverent care. "When I moved into this building in the 70s, it was specifically to monitor the cycle, to try to understand what had gone wrong and how to fix it. I've watched dozens of attic tenants come and go, some sensing the danger and fleeing, others being absorbed into the configuration. Why didn't you warn me more explicitly?" Oliver asked. Mrs. Winters returned the compass to him. The configuration had defenses. The more directly anyone tried to interfere, the more aggressively it responded. I could only provide subtle guidance and hope someone would piece together the truth independently. She smiled at him. You did. What happens to the apartment now? Elena asked. It returns to what it always should have been, a uniquely designed space with some unusual properties, but not a danger to those who live there. Mrs. Winters reached for a painted wooden box on her coffee table. I have something for you both, Blackwood's personal journals. Not the public ones in the Historical Society, but his private recordings. They may help you understand what he was truly trying to accomplish. As they left Mrs. Winters' apartment with the box of journals, Elena turned to Oliver on the landing. The full moon tonight will be the test. If the apartment remains stable, we'll know for certain the cycle is broken. You'll stay? Oliver asked, surprised. Of course. We broke interdimensional architecture together. I think that creates a certain bond, don't you? Her smile held a warmth that had nothing to do with dimensional theory. Besides, someone should be there in case you need rescuing from any remaining anomalies. That night, as the full moon rose over Boston, Oliver and Elena sat in the window seat of the attic apartment, Blackwood's private journals spread between them. The space remained resolutely normal, no shifting walls, no dimensional fluctuations, no mysterious voices or scratching sounds. The small door stayed a small door, leading only to a dusty storage closet. Outside, the city lights twinkled beneath a clear night sky, the full moon casting silver light across the historic rooftops of Beacon Hill. Inside, the apartment felt peaceful for the first time since Oliver had moved in, a space with history and character, but no malevolence. As midnight approached, Oliver found himself watching Elena more than the apartment around them. She had almost immediately immersed herself in Blackwood's journals, her physicist's mind quickly grasping concepts that would have taken Oliver weeks to process. Her presence felt right somehow, as if the entire bizarre sequence of events had been leading to this moment of collaboration. I think I understand what Blackwood was trying to do, Elena said suddenly, looking up from a densely notated journal page. He wasn't trying to create a space that existed in multiple configurations. He was trying to create a space where people could perceive multiple possible realities simultaneously, see the paths not taken, the choices that create divergent timelines. A way to view parallel universes? Oliver suggested. Exactly. But instead of just viewing them, the configuration accidentally created a nexus point where they overlapped, trapping consciousness between states. She closed the journal thoughtfully. What we experienced, what you broke, was Blackwood's experiment gone wrong. But his underlying theory might still be valid. That spaces can serve as windows between realities. Under very specific conditions, yes. Elena gestured to the moonlight streaming through the windows. Like during full moons, when certain energy frequencies align. Oliver considered this as he gazed out at the moon. So this apartment might still show us glimpses. Even though the dangerous part is deactivated. It's possible.
Blackwood's design was fundamentally sound, it was the implementation that created the trap. Elena smiled. We might still have the most interesting apartment in Boston on our hands. As if in response to her words, the moonlight crossing the floor briefly rippled, creating patterns that resembled the equations they'd been studying in Blackwood's journals. The effect lasted only seconds before fading back to normal light, but both of them had seen it. Well, Oliver said with a mixture of trepidation and excitement, it seems Blackwood's attic still has some secrets to share. But on our terms now, Elena replied, reaching out to take his hand. Not as prisoners, but as explorers. Together they watched as the full moon climbed higher, its light transforming the ordinary attic into something quietly magical, not the dangerous, consuming magic of before, but something gentler, an invitation rather than a trap. The boundary between worlds remained thin in this particular space, but now they could approach it with understanding rather than fear. Outside, Boston slept peacefully, unaware of the dimensional boundaries that had been breached and repaired in the old Victorian attic. Inside, two researchers who had been brought together by Blackwood's century-old experiment began planning how to safely explore what remained of his extraordinary discovery. The apartment had stopped changing against their will. Now, perhaps, they could learn to change it intentionally, opening windows between possibilities without losing themselves in the process. As midnight struck, Oliver felt a sense of completion rather than dread. The cycle was broken, but a new journey was just beginning. Whatever strange properties the attic retained, they would face them together, no longer victims of Blackwood's miscalculation, but heirs to his vision of expanded perception. The moonlight continued to paint subtle, shifting equations across the floor, and somewhere in the walls, a faint, friendly scratching could be heard, no longer a trapped consciousness, but merely the ordinary sounds of an old building settling into its new reality.